On January 6, 2021, rioters supporting President Donald Trump stormed the Capitol building in Washington, D.C., damaging and occupying several parts of the building. These rioters entered the office of House Speaker Nancy Pelosi, left explosive devices in the offices of the DNC and the GOP, as well as in a nearby vehicle, and in total, 4 rioters and 1 police officer were killed in these events. Could these events have been predicted by leftists with the powers of our minds and communism? Kinda. And I'll tell you how. I'm American Johnson, this is NonCompete. Let's learn how to predict the future with communism. So, what prompted these events? Well, to begin with, Trump promoted the Save America rally as a historic day, sharing this video on Twitter. Trump encouraged his followers to fight like hell and to take back our country, while Rudolph Giuliani called for trial by combat, and Trump Jr. threatened the opposition with the ominous threat, "We're coming for you." In the wake of the riot, Trump tweeted, "These are the things and events that happen when a sacred landslide election victory is so unceremoniously and viciously stripped away from great patriots who have been badly and unfairly treated for so long. Go home with love and peace.
Peace and love.
Remember this day forever." So, make no mistake, this was a fascist coup attempt. That's not to say it was a very well-planned or well-thought-out coup attempt, or that it had any hope for success, but it is clear that Trump and his minions wanted to see a chaotic rampage at the Capitol, and they got exactly what they ordered. Now, I have to say, I did predict that this event was going to be a shit show. And this tweet is the proof. And I did know that Trump was going to try to pull off some kind of shenanigans, some kind of coup as far back as election night. And here is the proof of that prediction. Of course, I'm not alone in making these kinds of predictions. Trump made his plans obvious. It was, in fact, obvious that any fascist in his position would have to do the same thing, more or less, given the nature of the fascist ideology. And that's what this video is all about. Obviousness and randomness, and how we on the left can use these concepts to predict the future. Not with magical psychic brain powers, but with political science. So let's talk a bit about dialectical materialism, a system of analysis formulated by Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels to develop their theories of communism. I've done a whole video on dialectical materialism in the past, and my partner Luna has a whole dang series on it over at her channel, but you don't really have to watch those first in order to understand this video. The long story short is, dialectical materialism is just a way of taking really complex systems and breaking them down for thorough understanding. You can think of dialectical materialism as a set of tools we can use to drill down and extract truth from things that are hella complicated. So today we're going to be focusing on just one of those tools from dialectical materialism, the category pair of obviousness versus randomness. There are 6 category pairs within the framework of dialectical materialism in total, and you can think of each category pair as a lens that will allow you to focus in on one aspect of a complex subject. So, in the case of obviousness versus randomness, we're focusing in on the predictability or unpredictability of systems and events. Actually, Luna already broke this down really well in one of her videos, so take it away, Luna.
Obviousness refers to things that always happen in certain conditions. Things that happen because of the internal material structure of things. Randomness refers to things that happen because of external reasons. It might happen, it might not happen. It might happen in this way, and it might happen in different ways. Nobody knows. For example, I'm holding a raw egg up high. If I drop the egg, I know that the egg will break. It's obvious that it will break. It will break because of the internal material structure of eggs. Eggs have shells that break when you drop them. So this is the obviousness concept at play. But will I drop the egg? Will I? This is the randomness concept. You don't know if I will drop the egg. Maybe I will, maybe I will not. I am an external factor that you cannot predict. And nope, I'm not going to drop this freaking egg because I don't want to clean up the freaking mess just for a YouTube video.
Thanks, Luna. So, looking at things through this lens of obviousness versus randomness, it's important when it comes to political strategy and planning. Obviously, the best plans will take advantage of the things that we can predict and also account for things that are more or less unpredictable. Since I was able to predict that January 6th was going to be a shit show, I was able to own this right-wing chud on Twitter. And as we all know, owning people on Twitter is the most important political action any of us can partake in. I'm not saying that studying dialectical materialism will really allow you to see into the future, but it will help you to develop insight into the nature of subjects so that our guesses about the future can become more accurate. A couple of things to note. First, this is not an exact science because there is no exact science. This is a complicated subject that deserves a video in its own right, but for now, I'll briefly read from Engels referring to Boyle's law. You know, the volume of a gas varies inversely to the pressure which it is subjected to. That Boyle's law? You know what I'm talking about. Anyway, Engels pointed out that Regnault found that this law does not hold good in certain cases. Had he been a philosopher of reality, he would have had to say, Boyle's law is mutable and is hence not a genuine truth, hence it is not a truth at all, hence it is an error. But had he done this, he would have committed an error far greater than the one that was contained in Boyle's law. His grain of truth would have been lost sight of in a sandhill of error. He would have distorted his originally correct conclusion into an error compared with which Boyle's law, along with the little particle of error that clings to it, would have seemed like truth. But Regnault, being a man of science, did not indulge in such childishness, but continued his investigations and discovered that in general Boyle's law is only approximately true. Boyle's law therefore was proved to be true only within definite limits. But is it absolutely and finally true within those limits? No physicist would assert that. Really scientific works, therefore, as a rule, avoid such dogmatically moral expressions as error and truth, while these expressions meet us everywhere in works such as the philosophy of reality, in which empty phrasemongering attempts to impose itself on us as the most sovereign result of sovereign thought. Engels' point here is not that we should not seek to deepen our understanding of the processes of the world. His point is that we must never fool ourselves into believing we have achieved a complete, absolute understanding of the processes of the world. Our understanding is always limited, always developing, just as dialectic negations are always developing. Engels wrote about this principle of development specifically as it pertains to obviousness and randomness in an article he wrote about German ideology in 1886. That which is recognized now as true has also its latent false side, which will later manifest itself, just as that which is now regarded as false has also its true side, by virtue of which it could previously be regarded as true. What is maintained to be necessary is composed of sheer accidents, and that the so-called accidental is the form behind which necessity hides itself, and so on. Okay, that was pretty heady stuff, but let's put it this way. Dialectical materialism is built upon an understanding that everything in our world is always changing. As Engels puts it, the great basic thought is that the world is not to be comprehended as a complex of ready-made things, but as a complex of processes in which the things apparently stable go through an uninterrupted change of coming into being and passing away. Of course, understanding this principle of development and applying it are, Engels admitted, two different things. So our great tasks as revolutionists is to do our best to analyze the world to the best of our abilities, always knowing that there are limits to our understanding and mistakes will be made. Engels pointed out that this is how all human understanding progresses. We must always begin with an ideal, a conception in our minds, and then test that ideal against material reality. Just as every science experiment begins with a hypothesis which is then tested against reality, political science is no different. As Engels wrote, the philosophy of history, of right, of religion, etc., has consisted in the substitution of an interconnection fabricated in the mind of the philosopher for the real interconnection to be demonstrated in events. So as we explore the category pair of obviousness versus randomness, remember, our understanding is always developing. We must always test our ideals against reality. We must always look to history and current events to see if things develop as we predict. And most importantly, we must always be willing and able to update our conception of these dynamics as reality unfolds around us. We have to be able to admit when we are wrong in our analysis and also know when we were correct. Remember, when we're looking at obviousness versus randomness, we're considering internal versus external factors. And the internal obvious factors of one subject may simultaneously be an external random factor for another subject. I know what I plan to do tomorrow, but you do not. For me, my plans are obvious. For you, they will seem more random. But over time, and with enough data points, the obvious can be drawn from the random. All right, enough philosophizing. Here's a concrete example. I personally found it obvious that Trump was going to whip his followers up into a frenzy at some point before the night of the election because of the fascistic rhetoric he was using and the nature of fascism, because of the dog whistles he was using, because of the signals he had been sending right from the night of the election.
Let's go to court. And did I predict this, Newt? Did I say this? I've been saying this from the day I heard they were going to send out tens of millions of ballots.
Trump's brand of fascism has internal characteristics that are fairly predictable. The double-speaking and dog-whistling used by Trump and QAnon drops and white nationalists today have a long lineage going all the way back to the origins of fascism. Veiled threats, plausible deniability, and euphemism have always been used by fascist leaders to direct their followers towards violence, especially in these early stages of fascism. I also know that the modern-day far right leans heavily on the strategy of stochastic terrorism to enact violence in the world. I have a couple of videos on stochastic violence if you haven't seen them already, but the basic idea is that violence can be called for in an oblique, indirect manner, and that's exactly what we were seeing in the days leading up to the Capitol riot. So we have here some internal features of MAGA fascism that make certain outcomes obvious in nature, and if you understand these internal characteristics well enough, then you can begin to make predictions with some degree of accuracy. I knew that January 6th would be a shit show, but there were enough external factors, random factors, such as the individuals who would be involved, that I could not have predicted exactly what that chaos would look like. For example, I could not have predicted that the Loyal Order of Water Buffaloes would get involved. Yes, that's right, I just made a deep-cut Flintstones reference. Do I know how to win over the Zoomer demographic or what? Another aspect of the events of January 6th that were pretty obvious was the behavior of the police at the Capitol building. The police in the USA have some internal characteristics that make it very obvious how they're going to react in certain situations. For one thing, the police are fascists. That is to say, there is a massive overlap between American blue shirts and American brown shirts. There's plenty of evidence of this, ranging from cops wearing QAnon patches and inhabiting fascist groups on the internet to cops calling far-right militia members friendlies after they've shot unarmed protesters, to the Capitol riot itself. The embarrassing lack of resistance the cops put up against the Capitol rioters was obvious and predictable due to these internal characteristics of American police. Look at the way cops respond to actions by the fascist Proud Boys versus how they respond to BLM and anti-fascist activists. So the cops in the USA are a fascistic entity that has a cozy relationship with other fascistic entities. This is an internal characteristic of American cops. So it should have been obvious, it should have been predictable that the cops would respond to BLM protesters like this, and they would respond to fascists like this. Obviously, there were plenty of random external factors that could not have been predicted, but it should have been generally obvious that cops weren't going to respond to fascists with the same kind of draconian violence as they have used against BLM protesters and anti-fascists. Knowing the difference between obviousness and randomness can have massive impact on all of society. Anyone who knows anything about pandemics knows that it was obvious that we would have another massive pandemic sooner or later. Countries that planned for this obviousness, like Vietnam, where I live, have done very well. Vietnam had a plan in place before COVID broke out for a pandemic, which is a major reason why the virus is currently completely contained here, and only 35 people have died, and the government already knows exactly how it plans to roll out this vaccine that they are developing once testing is completed a bit later this year. The Vietnamese people also knew that it was obvious that there would be another pandemic, at least since the first SARS outbreak back in the early 2000s. So the people here were already prepared to wear masks, social distance, and undergo lockdowns to contain contain the disease. I lived through the pandemic here, and there was virtually none of the panic that I saw in the USA in the early stages of the outbreak. People were prepared. They thought it was obvious that yes, we will have another pandemic at some point sooner or later. But in the US, you see, the government and the people were not prepared for the obvious threat of the pandemic, or at least they weren't under the Trump administration, and it thus felt random to millions of Americans who did not expect such an outbreak, and the results have been catastrophically deadly. As Vietnam and a few other countries have proven, it is possible to make effective plans based on the obvious internal characteristics of something as complicated as an international health crisis, even if we can't predict all the random external factors such as exactly when, where, and how quickly such a pandemic might emerge. Now, just to show some humility at least, let me say that back in December 2019 and January 2020, when COVID was just starting to emerge in China, I did not take it all that seriously. I thought Luna was being a bit overdramatic when she started demanding that we wear masks and avoid going outside, but I quickly came to realize that she was absolutely right to be cautious. She and most of the rest of the folks here in Vietnam saw the obvious, and I did not. Now, let's look at the George Floyd uprising and the primacy of the Black Lives Matter movement in 2020. I made a video all about how I totally did not see that coming, and I think I should have. Of course, I wasn't alone. I think a lot of leftists didn't see the George Floyd movement coming, especially a lot of white leftists like myself, even though many Black Americans saw it as something that was obviously on the horizon. There were, after all, profoundly obvious internal characteristics of the police and the American prison state coming to a head with these communities in the USA that were being brutalized. It was obvious to many in the Black community that the confrontation would have to occur sooner or later. The specific event of George Floyd's tragic murder was in some ways apparently random. It could be seen as a spark that ignited a powder keg, but that some spark was going to come should have been obvious to anyone who pays attention to the subject of police brutality in the USA. I missed it along with many of my fellow leftists, and that is an unfortunate fact. What if more of us had done a better job analyzing these obvious dynamics, the internal characteristics of the police state? What if we had seen it coming as we could and should have? Perhaps we could have had better preparations with defensive gear, gas masks, bail funds, shields, anti-police tactics, and all the other equipment and systems and training that we had to develop on an ad hoc basis throughout the 2020 protests. Certainly, there were people who were prepared for this, but it would have obviously been better if a lot more people were prepared. It could have saved countless lives and prevented countless injuries if we had been better prepared. So this is serious stuff. Of course, COVID and the BLM protests were not the only situations that I did not predict accurately in 2020, even though I probably should have. Back in 2019, during the DNC primaries, when we were all so innocent and young, I was pretty confident that Joe Biden would not become the candidate for the DNC. As much as I was hoping it would be Bernie, I didn't really expect him to make it through the DNC electioneering either. I saw what happened in 2016 after all. I was thinking it was probably gonna be somebody like Elizabeth Warren or Pete Buttigieg who would get the nomination. Biden just seemed like such an overtly conservative neoliberal. I figured there was no way that he would make it through. It seemed to me like the DNC would have to pick someone with at least some token appeal to progressive liberals, since the progressive movement has grown so much since 2016 in the USA. So at first, when Biden was chosen, I gotta say, I was pretty sidelined. It seemed like such a random result to me, but looking back now, I can see that it was the obvious outcome, and Biden was the obvious choice for the DNC. After all, the DNC is an overtly conservative neoliberal party with overtly conservative neoliberals in charge. When I look back now, I honestly can't imagine anyone else having been chosen based on the internal characteristics of the Democrats. Of course they would go ride or die for a guy who wants to veto universal health care during a pandemic, and of course his running mate would be a notorious hot cop attorney general during a period of unprecedented civil unrest due to police violence. This was not a random occurrence set about by external factors pressuring the DNC. It was completely obvious. It happened based on the internal dynamics of the Democratic National Convention, and frankly, I'm embarrassed that I ever thought otherwise. So now that we've looked at some past examples of analysis using obviousness versus randomness, let's now turn our eyes towards the future. As leftists, in 2021, it will be strategically necessary for us to start making a plan based on what seems obvious and what might be random, but we must be careful because any error may send us down the wrong path, hampering the progress of our movement. The predictions I'm about to make are for entertainment purposes only. Planning revolutionary activity requires really serious and coordinated analysis, and I wrote this script by myself in one afternoon, so please don't take it too seriously. All I'm really trying to do is show you how you might use dialectical materialist category pair of obviousness and randomness in your own strategic planning and analysis. Okay, so let's give it a go. Question 1, what impact will the Capitol riots have on Biden's administration? We can already see that the DNC and liberal media institutions are finally taking Trump's fascism at least kind of seriously in response to the violence at the Capitol. The DNC is finally again pushing to impeach Trump, and Twitter and Facebook have finally kicked Trump off of their platforms. Now, one has to wonder, why did it take so friggin' long? Why were there no repercussions to Trump bragging about ordering the assassination of Michael Reinl, or Trump sending federal police to brutalize BLM protesters and kidnap them in unmarked vans? Why was the Capitol violence taken more seriously than the Trump administration's genocidal negligence in responding to COVID-19, which has led to the deaths of about 350,000 people so far? Well, the answer to that question is pretty obvious. Trump's followers storming the Capitol threatened powerful political figures directly, but even more importantly, the riot threatened the legitimacy of the state. As many liberal pundits have since commented, a rowdy gang of fasci hooligans horsing off in the vaunted halls of the majestic palace of federal power that is the Capitol building was embarrassing for the United States government. Murdering hundreds of innocent BLM protesters and hundreds of thousands of COVID victims is one thing, but making the state look bad, we can't have that. It's completely shameful that the Democrats and capitalist media and social media platforms have waited until Trump's last week in office to finally confront him and his fascist followers, but it shouldn't be surprising if you understand the obvious internal characteristics of capitalist hegemony. Looking ahead with these obvious characteristics of capitalism in the state in mind, we should see it as obvious that the state will do all it can to legitimize Joe Biden and the office of the presidency in the weeks to come. In the coming months, it's obvious that the DNC and Joe Biden will begin passing domestic terrorism legislation and making changes to ensure that something like the Capitol riot doesn't occur again with Biden as president. It should also be obvious that liberalism views fascism and anti-fascist ideologies like anarchism and communism as competitors, and so these laws will restrict fascist and anti-fascist action indiscriminately. Biden has already said he wants to give $300 million to the police once he takes office, so it should be obvious that these funds will be used to reshape the police in some way, not to reduce violence against innocent black people, of course, nor to reduce the lethal cruelty of the American police state, but to bolster the strength of the neoliberal capitalist hegemony under Joe Biden and the DNC Congress. This should be obvious based on the authoritarian wolf in sheep's clothing characteristics of neoliberalism, which we saw very well under the Obama-Biden administration in places like Ferguson. Now, here's another question. What's going to happen to Donald Trump and his fascist following in the weeks and months to come? For that matter, what's going to happen to the Republican Party in a post-Trump world? I think in the short term, there's a lot of randomness here. Trump can be a bit of a wild card himself, but I haven't seen any indication that he's going to tamp down on his dog whistling or calls for violence. While I think it's unlikely that he will directly stage a coup up to the inauguration, I do take Trump at his word when he said in his second to last tweet, "The 75 million great American patriots who voted for me, America first, and Make America Great Again, will have a giant voice long into the future." I also believe him in his very last tweet when he says he will not be going to the inauguration on January 20th. Knowing Trump, there will be some moments of chaos between now and the 20th. That much is obvious based on the internal characteristics of his personal psychology and the fascist ideology of his followers. But there are just too many random external factors to know exactly what form this chaos is going to take. All I know is I wouldn't want to be anywhere near Washington, D.C. or any other city with a large fascist population around January 20th when Biden takes office. But looking into the longer term, there are some obvious angles which do allow us to make some predictions here. It's obvious that a lot of the more traditional Republicans who have been opportunistically backing Trump will continue to distance themselves from the MAGA crowd and attempt to recede back into the melange of milquetoast neoliberal republicanism of Reagan, Bush, and John McCain. The fasci elements of the GOP at every level will have to make a call. Are they going to stick with Trump and the QAnon crowd to entrench their fascist position, or will they jump ship like Betsy DeVos and Mick Mulvaney and several other staff members of Trump to try to blend back into the conservative crowd? Trump and his most diehard followers certainly aren't going to just disappear. It's simply an obvious internal characteristic of Donald Trump and QAnon magats that they are true believers, cult-like, smellers of their own farts, and groups like the Proud Boys will be more active and violent than ever in 2021. Now that he's off Twitter and Facebook, with other prominent fascists either already deplatformed or likely to follow, alternative institutions will be built and bolstered by displaced Nazis. Going back to the internal characteristics of capitalist hegemony, it's obvious that a lot of these media crackdowns will have collateral impact on leftists on social media. Anti-fascists, anarchists, communists, and other radical leftists have already been similarly deplatformed, and this is likely to get worse in 2021. You see, when we say that liberals want to go back to brunch now that Biden is president, we mean that it is an internal characteristic of liberalism that they do not want the status quo to be challenged in any way. And mind you, I'm including garden variety Democrats and Republicans alike when I say liberals here. Mainstream corporate Republicans and Democrats and their centrist followers are going to want to leave the late teens and 2020 behind in 2021. They want to put their fingers in their ears, cover their eyes, and pretend everything is normal again, even though normalcy for black folks, LGBTQ folks, poor folks, and a whole lot of other folks has been nothing but violent and chaotic going back to the foundation of the USA. So yeah, fascists and anti-fascists alike, really anyone who wants to change the status quo, will be targeted by censorship and deplatforming by neoliberal political and media institutions. In this regard, Trump and the fascists have a head start on us. InfoWars, Fox News, 4chan, and Parler, and various other media and social media platforms exist for the right. This echoes to me the situation about 4 or 5 years ago when right-wing extremists had a commanding presence on YouTube and other social media platforms in the wake of Gamergate. Fortunately, anarchists, communists, anti-fascists, and other radical leftists have been able to rapidly build our own presence on social media, but we should see it as obvious that just as easily as the fascists are now being routed from these platforms, we on the left can and will eventually be routed out from these platforms. Because again, an internal characteristic of neoliberalism is to maintain the status quo of capitalism. So I suggest we begin building and bolstering leftist platforms of our own. I hope that we can see more leftists on PeerTube and Mastodon. I hope that camaraderie.co gets launched soon. I hope that more of you will subscribe to Means TV, which, by the way, I can get you a pretty cool discount on if you become a NonCompete Patreon, so you should check that out. Oh, what's going on? It's a theory alert! If you've studied dialectical materialism, you're probably familiar with the principle of quantities and qualities. If not, congratulations, you're not a giant nerd like I am. Long story short, things are always gradually changing over time. A seed doesn't instantly become a tree. It grows slowly, and when enough quantities of characteristics have changed from seed-like to tree-like, the quality of the object that was a seed becomes a tree. Sometimes, as something is in the process of undergoing this kind of quality change, it can get a little temporarily stuck because the forces of change on either side are temporarily balanced. We call this state equilibrium, and I believe fascism and neoliberalism have been in a state of equilibrium throughout 2020. And uneasy détente, that's nerd talk for ceasefire, has set in as fascists have confronted BLM and leftists in the streets, and fascist QAnon weirdos have been partially subdued by their confidence in the group of bumbling assholes who occupied the White House until now. Now, as I discussed in my video on the liberal-fascist bargain, neoliberalism will support fascism in surreptitious ways to oppose leftism whenever we threaten capitalism. For the 4 years of Trump's presidency, the liberal media and DNC opposition tried to maintain a state of equilibrium, allowing fascism to spread as a counter to socialist ideas, which have also been growing more popular. To me, it also seems obvious that liberals have allowed violence between fascists and anti-fascists, including the police, throughout 2020, and every attempt has been made to put all of the blame for all of the violence on anarchists and Antifa by fascists and neoliberals alike. Neoliberals want to be able to point at the conflict between fascists and anti-fascists as evidence that the neoliberal center is a bastion of peace and stability. But what do you think would have happened if anti-fascists did not confront fascism? What if nobody stood up to police brutality and groups like the Proud Boys? The state certainly isn't prepared to oppose police brutality, and the police are certainly not prepared to oppose fascist violence. Only leftists and anti-fascists and radical black liberation activists have been willing and able to stand against this violence. So, all of this should be obvious to the people who understand the internal characteristics of the state, of fascism, of white supremacism, and of neoliberalism. Neoliberalism has supported fascism, but only opportunistically. If neoliberals feel they've gotten the upper hand, they will jump on it. Now that it seems that Trump is leaving the White House, despite all the promises delivered by Q Drops and Trump himself, this state of equilibrium between fascism and neoliberalism is coming to an end. I believe the Capitol riot marked a quality shift, both for fascists and neoliberals, and the fascists and neoliberals of 2021 are going to look quite a bit different from the fascists and neoliberals of 2020. I'm so tired of saying neoliberal. Further evidence of this is that neoliberals are quite suddenly pushing Trump and his fascist minions off of capitalist platforms now, in the final days of the Trump administration, to clean house for a resurrection of neoliberal ideals, Congress, and the White House. It seems to me that neoliberals see this as an opportunity to shore up their power, and it should be obvious based on the internal characteristics of neoliberalism that we on the left will also be targeted in this year and the years to come. Neoliberals feel on top of the world right now, and so they may be mothballing that uneasy, surreptitious alliance that they've been having with fascism ever since Trump took office. So how will the relationship between fascism and neoliberalism evolve in 2021? How will these dynamics shape out? That remains to be seen, but I do think that we can make some predictions based on the internal characteristics, the obvious nature of fascism and neoliberalism. So here's another question. What's going to happen with the cops? The Biden-Harris administration has been very adamant that they do not support defunding and abolishing the police. On the contrary, they want to give the cops $300 million more. I see a lot of randomness in this dynamic because there are so many external factors in conflict with each other. We know that throughout 2020, the fascists supported the police. We also know that the fascists have always had great success infiltrating and indoctrinating the police. However, now that fascists and police have been having direct clashes, and they're likely to have more, we are starting to see some fascists opposing the police, up to and including killing a cop at the Capitol riot. Not that that's the first cop fascists have killed in the last year. Now that fascists don't have their guy in the White House, there will be more confrontations between fascists and the state. Will this lead to a widening rift with cops, or will cops continue to abet fascism? Anyone who has studied the origins of policing, and I have a video on my channel that goes through the history of policing, anyone who studied this stuff knows that the internal characteristics of the police will not allow for Biden and Harris to have success reducing police brutality against marginalized communities, no matter how much money they throw at this problem. So how will things develop as the liberals take over executive authority of this brutal state machine? This depends a lot on us, the left, and how effectively police abolitionists are able to communicate and spread our ideas. In this case, we are the external factor, which gives us a lot of power to control the randomness if we choose the right strategies. We can have a real impact in 2021 when it comes to the police. We will have opportunities. It's on us to leverage those opportunities and move the needle on this problem. I believe things are going to develop very rapidly in 2021, and the left has a lot of great opportunities to build our movement and weaken both liberalism and fascism this year. But we also face a lot of challenges, from fascist violence to neoliberal primacy to censorship and civil liberty crackdowns that are probably coming our way. What obvious internal characteristics of the current hegemony you see? What random external factors must we consider in our planning? Do you disagree with any of my assessments here? Sound off in the comments. I know you will anyway. And as always, stay safe and solidarity. Thanks for watching. I'll see you in the future. Cat!
A question: communism. Ever hear of Karl Marx? In his mind, communism was born more than 100 years ago. He looked at the world and saw men as divided into two classes: workers and capitalists. In the Communist Manifesto, he called upon the workers, the proletarians, to rise up and overthrow their capitalistic masters. He cried, "The proletarians have nothing to lose but their chains. They have a world to win. Working men of all countries, unite." This was the promise and the challenge of communism. In Russia, the Tsar was the government. To support the wealthy aristocracy, millions of peasants toiled in virtual slavery. The Cossacks, dreaded police of the Tsar, enforced tyrannical laws. Here was fertile ground for the ideas of communism. For here, indeed, the people had nothing to lose but their chains, the chains of the imperial government. In 1914, the Tsar sent his troops into the war that swept Europe. For more than 2 years they fought. While at home, people suffered from shortages, brought about the despotism and corruption of the imperial government. The people grew rebellious. Only a strong army could sustain the Tsar in power. But revolution was preached on the battlefield, too, to an army broken with corruption. Inevitably, the Russian army surrendered. And with the defeated army returning under the banners of revolution, the imperial government fell.